In this video, we will be replacing the fuel pump in this 2001 Ford F150. This repair will be done inside the garage because outside of the garage there is a blizzard. Given the limited space within the garage will enhance the difficulty of this repair. As it sits, there is a little bit under a half a tank of fuel left in the gas tank. This calculates out to roughly between 10 to 12 gallons of fuel in the tank. On this particular type of vehicle, we can remove the fuel pump one of two ways. One, we can remove the entire box or the back end of the truck and access it from the top. The second method is to go underneath the truck, drop the fuel tank, and access the fuel pump that way. If I were to access the fuel pump by removing the box, I would first need to remove the bed liner and also have a few extra people to help me move the box. Each method will prove to have difficulties, but for this particular one I will be going underneath the vehicle, dropping the tank, and replacing it that way. The primary reason why I want to do this is that I want to inspect the inside of the tank as well to see if that needs clean, because there is about 115,000 miles on this vehicle and there is a chance that there is some sediment buildup or other deposits in the bottom of the tank. Now, before beginning any work, we want to make sure and disconnect the negative side of the battery terminal first. This will prevent anything to happen with the electrical system while we're working on the vehicle. To increase access while I am working on this, I have jacked the truck up and slid rhino ramps underneath it. I have also placed jack stands under the axles so that if the rhino ramps were to fail, the jack stands would at least catch the vehicle before it went all the way to the ground. Additionally, I have placed wheel chocks both in front and behind the front tires. If we take a look underneath the vehicle, we can see where the gas tank is mounted. If we take a little bit closer look, we can see that there is a skid plate that is covering the bottom side of the fuel tank. Before we can remove the fuel tank, obviously we must remove the skid plate. Taking a look underneath the vehicle, we can see that the skid plate is connected to a bracket which is connected to the frame. There are a series of 2 bolts in several locations on the driver's side of the skid plate, and on the passenger side of the skid plate we have the same bracket but only 1 bolt in 2 different locations, one towards the rear and one towards the front. For each of the bolts, I'm first going to spray a little bit of Amsoil's metal protector. This will act as a penetrating oil and will help when I'm taking the bolts out. In total, there are 6 bolts that we will be removing. Now that I have allowed the metal protector to penetrate into the rust on those bolts, I am ready to remove them. Now, after loosening all of the bolts, I went ahead and placed a couple jack stands below the skid plate so that as I remove the bolts, I can rest that skid plate on those jack stands. The skid plate weighs about 40 pounds, so you want to be very careful when you're lowering it so that you don't drop it on yourself, since we are laying on the ground working underneath the vehicle. It does take a little bit of maneuvering to get out once all the bolts are out to actually drop that down, but given that there are jack stands in place, it will help the situation so that we don't drop it on ourselves. And once you have it resting on the jack stands, we can slowly push the jack stands out of the way and maneuver that down onto the ground. At this point we can clearly see the tank. We can see both of the straps that are holding the tank up, and we have full access to it. Looking underneath the truck, right on the other side of where you typically fill up at the gas station, we have the fuel tank filler hose and a vapor hose coming off of the fuel filler neck. If we follow both of those lines, the fuel filler hose and the vapor line, we can see a couple different connection points for each of these. These right now are connected to the tank, and if we were to drop the tank, it would be pulling on those. So we need to make sure we disconnect these hoses prior to dropping the tank. Using a little bit of Amsoil's metal protector, I'm going to lubricate the screws on the clamps so that they will be easy to remove. And I will let that soak in just for a few minutes. Using a nut driver or a flathead screwdriver, we should be able to loosen those clamps. And now that both of our clamps are free, we should be able to slide that tubing back. To do this, I'm going to use a pair of slip joint pliers and clamp onto the tubing and slide that back. Once our clamps are loose and our vapor line is disconnected, I'm going to loosen our 3 bolts located in our gas cap area. After loosening the clamp on the fuel filler hose, you can see that my fuel filler tube is loose and can move around. I'm going to use this to my advantage to twist and maneuver the fuel filler tube out. At this point, I went ahead and set up 2 jack stands located directly below the gas tank. Now there is an additional 5 or 6 connections to the top of the fuel tank. These include the fuel lines, the electronics to the fuel pump, the sending unit electrical connector, as well as the evap vapor lines. Because they are so difficult to get to and you can't actually see what you're doing, there is a little bit of slack in the lines that we can lower the tank just slightly onto the jack stands, which will give us access on top of the tank to remove those connections. On these straps, there is 1 bolt on the passenger side for each strap. On the driver's side of the tank, there is a clip where it clips into the frame. Using a little bit of Amsoil's metal protector will help loosen the bolts. Now it is worth noting that although I have siphoned out as much gasoline out of the tank as I can, there is a good chance there is still gasoline in the tank. Every gallon of gasoline weighs a little bit over 8 pounds, so depending on how much I got out, the tank could be pretty heavy as I loosen up these bolts, so you want to make sure it's supported very well. Now, I originally estimated there to be about 10 to 12 gallons of fuel in the tank, so there's a good chance that the tank will weigh about 80 to 100 pounds. After I dropped the tank and had it sit on the jack stands, I went ahead and tied a length of rope underneath the pan just in case the jack stands give out or something happens where they tip over. The rope is my redundancy that will at least hold the fuel tank relatively in place until I can figure out what to do next. From this angle, we can see the fuel sending unit wiring harness. We can also see both of the fuel lines, the send and return. Moving the camera just slightly, we can see the fuel vapor line hose. Moving down to the other end of the tank, we have a fuel tank vent valve. I have my vapor hose that connects up with the fill tube. I also have the fill tube itself. And lastly, we have the fuel tank pressure sensor. To remove the fuel tank vent valve, we first need to squeeze the clamp and push that back on the hose. Then we can take pliers and slowly work that hose off of the valve, and then we can pull on the hose to remove that. You have to be careful though that you don't break the hose. Our fuel tank pressure sensor harness has a tab that you push down and you wiggle the plug and it will come off. Now we have already disconnected the vapor hose and fill tube on the other end of these hoses, and we can just leave these chunks of hoses connected to the fuel tank, because when we drop the fuel tank, those little chunks of hoses will just come out as well. Our fuel vapor line hose can be removed in a similar fashion as the other one. And the trickiest part with all of these is that you can't actually see what you're doing. Most of it has to be done by feel. We have a wiring harness for our sending unit. And again, there's a button that you'd press and you wiggle the connector and they will come apart. And then we need to disconnect the fuel lines, both the send and return. But first we need to remove the safety clamps that are on the fuel lines. And if we pry those back and wiggle those off, they're fairly easy to remove. After that, we can use a fuel line disconnect tool and work both of the fuel lines off. It can be a bit tricky. Again, you can't actually see what you're working on. You have to do it mostly by feel only. Now, once these fuel lines have been disconnected, those are our last connections of those 8 connections on the fuel tank. We can lower the fuel tank on the ground, whether you have it on jack stands or you have that length of rope holding it up. That can be removed and the fuel tank can be drug out from underneath the vehicle. Keep in mind that there is about 100 pounds of fuel in the tank still. Now that the snow has stopped and I got the driveway shoveled, we can take a look at the tank in the daylight. Now that we can see things a little bit clearer, we have the fuel tank vent valve. We have our vapor hose. We have our fill tube. And we have our fuel tank pressure sensor. On the other side of our tank, we have our fuel sending unit wiring harness. We have our fuel lines, both the send and return. And we have our fuel vapor line hose. Before we go any further, I like to take some compressed air and blow off some of the debris off of the top of the tank. I then like to take Amsoil's metal protector and some shop towels and clean off some of the surfaces of the tank. The more dirt and grime that I can get off now, the less likely anything will get inside the tank as I am replacing the pump. Additionally, I like things to be cleaned up. Using a permanent marker, we can create some alignment marks so that when we install the new pump, we can orient it correctly. There are 6 mounting bolts on the fuel pump assembly. I like to go around and loosen every other bolt just to evenly reduce any tension that is on that. that kind of goes back to that theory of tighten your lug nuts in a star-shaped pattern. It's just something I do. Probably not completely necessary, but it's just a habit that I have. Now I did notice that the sticker on this fuel pump is dated March 16th, 2001. It is the original fuel pump with the vehicle. The vehicle is about 15 years old, has about 115,000 miles on it, and calculates probably that it has pumped about 9,000 gallons of gasoline. Once all of our bolts are loose, we can remove each one of those and attempt to lift the fuel pump out. Now, there is a good chance it's probably stuck in place because it has been on there a very long time. So, very carefully, we can use a flathead screwdriver and slowly work it underneath the fuel pump where it is sealed to the tank and pry that open. Be very careful not to damage the fuel tank. And once that seal has released, we should be able to gently lift the fuel pump out from the fuel tank. At this point, we want to double check that the old fuel pump looks like the new fuel pump. If something does not look quite right, I would double check to make sure you have the right part. Using a shop vac very carefully around the opening where the fuel pump meets the fuel tank, we can vacuum up any debris that has been caught or accumulated around that pump so that our new pump will seat securely. Using a black Sharpie, I'm going to draw my alignment mark in the same location on the new pump that I drew it on the old pump. At this point, we can put the new seal ring on our tank with the alignment tabs in the correct orientation, and then we can gently install the new fuel pump assembly into our fuel tank. Be careful that you don't bend any of the components. By aligning all of our marks and tabs, we can make sure to install it in the correct orientation. At this point, we can install all of our mounting bolts and torque those to specifications, as well as double check to make sure everything looks good before we reinstall the tank onto the vehicle. To remove the tank, I used rope around the tank, which allowed me to slowly lower the tank. To raise the tank, I'm going to be using some ratcheting straps. With the new fuel pump in, I can begin to position my tank back in place underneath the vehicle. So what I've done is I have a ratchet strap around the tank, and I have my jack stands underneath the tank as well. I've lifted the tank about halfway up, and I'm going to attempt to connect as many of the connections as I can given the slack that is on each of the hoses. All connection points should be done in the reverse order that we did them earlier. When reconnecting the fuel lines, you want to make sure you hear a definite click. And at this point, make sure that 6 of those 8 connection points are securely reinstalled. After those 6 connection points are reconnected, we can reinstall the straps for our fuel tank, and all other components like the skid plate and the fuel filler tube, all that can be reinstalled in the reverse order that we took it off. Now, according to the manufacturer of the fuel pump, we want to refuel the tank with a minimum of 10 gallons Then we want to cycle the ignition key on and off in 3-second intervals for up to 5 to 10 cycles until the vehicle is started.